What happens when fear rules a workplace? When a man so powerful, so untouchable, builds an empire where silence is safer than honesty, and loyalty is bought, not earned. Jonathan Steele was that man, a millionaire CEO whose very presence made his employees lower their eyes and hold their breath. To them, he was not a leader, but a shadow looming over every desk, every meeting, every decision. Then came Claire Whitmore, an ordinary secretary on her first day, who stumbled into his world with nothing but courage and conviction. She wasn't intimidated by his wealth or his reputation. She looked him in the eye when no one else dared, and with a single act of defiance, she began unraveling everything he thought he knew about power, loyalty, and even love. But could one woman truly change a man who had built his life on control? Could compassion overcome fear? Or would the walls of pride and betrayal prove too strong? And what happens when justice, humanity, and love collide in the heart of a man once believed to be made of stone? Stay with us until the end. You won't believe where this story leads. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story that just might change the way you see the world. Claire Whitmore stood at the glass entrance of Steele Industries, clutching a paper tray that carried 2 cups of coffee. The early morning wind of Chicago had been merciless, biting at her face as if trying to warn her to turn back. But now, inside the marble lobby with its polished floors and silent security guards, it wasn't the cold that made her hands tremble. It was the knowledge that this was her first day, her first chance to prove herself in a company known across the Midwest, not only for its financial success, but also for the chilling reputation of its leader, Jonathan Steele. The very name carried weight. People whispered it in the elevators, muttered it in coffee shops near the office, and lowered their voices whenever his presence was near. Some called him a genius, others a tyrant. All agreed on one thing: he was not a man you wanted to cross. Claire, at 34, had faced her share of difficulties in life. She had cared for her younger brother through his illness, balanced 2 jobs while finishing her degree, and endured the quiet loneliness that came after losing both parents too soon. Those years had given her something far more valuable than polish or charm. They had given her resilience. She whispered to herself, "It's just another office, just another boss. You've handled worse." Yet the knot in her stomach didn't ease. As she moved past the security desk, she offered a smile to the receptionist, a young woman who looked at her badge, then at her, with an expression that mixed pity and curiosity, almost as if she were silently saying, "You poor thing, you have no idea what you're walking into." Claire kept moving. The sound of her heels clicked against the marble, echoing too loudly in the quiet space. She adjusted her grip on the coffee tray, telling herself that bringing an extra cup for Mr. Steele might soften their introduction. It was a small gesture, but kindness had carried her through tougher doors before. Then, as if the universe itself had been waiting for the perfect moment to test her, her right heel slipped against the glossy floor. The tray wobbled. Her heart leapt. She tried to steady it, but the more she fought for balance, the more it tilted. And then, with tragic elegance, one of the cups flew. Time slowed. She saw the arc of the coffee as if painted in the air, rich and steaming, before it landed squarely on the chest of a man in a charcoal suit. The liquid spread across his crisp white shirt, darkening the expensive fabric in an instant. Silence fell. It was as if the entire lobby had stopped breathing. Claire's gaze climbed upward from the ruined shirt to the sharply cut jaw, the piercing gray eyes, and the expression of a man who carried authority like armor. Jonathan Steele, the very man she had hoped to impress. Her breath caught in her throat. She could hear the faint buzzing of the fluorescent lights above, the shuffle of someone's shoes far behind. But all she felt was the weight of his stare. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jonathan lowered his eyes to his ruined suit, then back to her face. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, yet edged with steel. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Her instinct screamed at her to apologize profusely, to beg for forgiveness. But another part of her, the part that had carried her through hospitals, debts, and endless nights of quiet worry, refused to cower. Claire lifted her chin, and before she could stop herself, she said softly, "Well, at least it matches your suit, and for the record, it's premium roast." The air seemed to crack. A gasp escaped the receptionist's lips. Even the guard behind the desk looked up from his phone, wide-eyed. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He was not a man accustomed to sarcasm, much less from someone he had never seen before. For an instant, his expression flickered surprise, maybe disbelief, before settling back into a mask of cold control. "Your name?" he demanded. "Claire." "Claire Whitmore," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Your new secretary." The silence that followed was unbearable. She wondered if she had just sabotaged her career on the very first minute of the very first day. Jonathan studied her, eyes narrowing slightly. "Perfect," he murmured, though there was no warmth in the word. "First day. And you're already unforgettable." Claire opened her mouth to explain, to apologize, but he raised a hand. 10 minutes, my office, bring a cloth." And with that, he turned, walking toward the elevator with a presence so commanding that even gravity seemed to bend out of his way. Only when he disappeared did the murmurs rise again. "Oh my God," someone whispered. "She's done for. Not even 10 minutes in." Claire bent to pick up the empty cup from the floor. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she managed to whisper to herself, "Well, welcome to the dream job, Claire." As the elevator carried her upward, she replayed the scene again and again. The coffee, the silence, the sharpness of his eyes. And though dread weighed heavily on her, somewhere deep inside, a flicker of something else stirred, not just fear, not just regret, but the sense that her life had just collided with his for reasons she could not yet understand. By the time Claire reached the 25th floor, the air felt heavier than it had in the marble lobby. The hallway stretched out before her, silent, lined with glass offices where employees bent over their screens with the intensity of surgeons. No one looked up, no one greeted her. It was as though fear itself walked these corridors, keeping voices hushed and steps quick. She could still feel the warmth of dozens of eyes following her earlier, watching her stumble into the one man no one dared to cross. And she could almost hear the whispers traveling like wildfire. The new secretary spilled coffee on Jonathan Steele, and she talked back. The thought should have terrified her. Yet, as she walked toward the double doors marked Jonathan Steele, CEO, Claire felt an unexpected calm settle in. Her palms were dry, her heart beat steady. Perhaps it was because she had already committed the worst possible mistake. Once you've embarrassed yourself in front of a man like Steele, what else is there to fear? She pushed the doors open. The office was larger than some apartments she had rented in her 20s. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Chicago skyline, glass towers stabbing the gray morning sky. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive cologne. A mahogany desk sat like an altar in the center, stacked with neatly aligned papers. Behind it, Jonathan stood, his jacket removed, blotting at the stain on his shirt with a white cloth that was already ruined. His eyes lifted to hers, cold and sharp. "You're late," he said. "It's been 9 minutes," Claire answered evenly. 9, he repeated, tossing the cloth onto the desk. "In my world, 9 minutes can mean the difference between closing a deal and losing a fortune." Claire set her shoulders. "Then I suppose you'd better hope my next 9 minutes are worth the loss." The air snapped between them like a drawn bowstring. Jonathan studied her, his expression unreadable. Finally, he gestured toward a chair in front of the desk. "Sit." Claire sat. She placed her notebook on her lap, pen ready. "I don't hire people to make excuses," he began, his voice clipped. "I hire them to anticipate needs before I voice them, to understand the unspoken, to carry weight without complaint. Do you believe you can do that?" Claire held his gaze. Yes. His lips curved slightly, not in amusement, but in challenge. Good. Then your first assignment is to organize the corporate archive, files spanning 15 years, sorted alphabetically, chronologically, and by department, by tomorrow. She almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. Instead, she asked calmly, "Do you also want them color-coded, or would that be too much?" For a fraction of a second, she thought she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. Then it was gone. "You'll find sarcasm doesn't serve you here," he said flatly. "And you'll find that I don't scare easily," she replied. Silence stretched between them again. Outside the glass walls, employees shifted uneasily, sneaking glances at the exchange. It was rare, unheard of, even for anyone to speak to Jonathan Steele in anything but hushed obedience. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. "Do you know what people say about me, Miss Whitmore?" Claire shook her head slowly. "I don't listen to rumors. They usually say more about the speaker than the subject. They say I'm ruthless, arrogant, impossible to please. They're right. Or maybe," she said softly, "you just like reminding people who's in charge." His eyes narrowed. "And you think you're different? I think I'm here to do my job," she answered, "not to tremble every time you walk past my desk." For the first time since she had met him, Jonathan seemed taken aback. He didn't show it much, just the faintest lift of his brows, a pause that lasted a second too long, but Claire saw it, and she knew he was calculating. She could almost hear his thoughts. Who is this woman who doesn't flinch? What game is she playing? Jonathan rose to his feet, moving toward the window. He stood with his back to her, hands clasped behind him, the skyline stretching endlessly before him. "You will either last a week," he said finally, "or you will outlast them all. I haven't decided which yet." Claire let out a slow breath. She didn't know whether it was a threat, a prophecy, or both. "Then let's find out," she said quietly. He turned his head just slightly, enough for her to see his profile, sharp and unyielding, dismissed. Claire stood, gathering her notebook. She left the office with steady steps, aware of the eyes that immediately darted away as she passed through the hall. By the time she reached her small desk just outside the double doors, the whispers had already returned. She didn't catch every word, but she didn't need to. The message was clear. The office had found its newest story. The woman who dared to stand against Jonathan Steele, whether she was brave or foolish, remained to be seen. But as Claire sat down, her hands finally trembling now that she was alone, one truth settled in her chest. Her first impression had been made, and it would not be forgotten. By the third morning at Steele Industries, Claire had already learned one truth. Jonathan Steele was not simply a demanding boss. He was a man who crafted impossible tests as if he were a general, measuring the endurance of his soldiers. At exactly 8 o'clock, his voice cut through the intercom on her desk. "Whitmore, my office." "Now?" Claire set down her coffee, smoothed her blouse, and walked inside. Jonathan didn't look up immediately. He was flipping through a folder with the deliberate calm of a man who knew he controlled the room even without eye contact. "I need you to reorganize the financial records of the entire acquisitions department," he said at last. "Alphabetically, then chronologically, then by relevance. Noon deadline." Claire blinked. She had seen the archives the day before, more than 1,000 documents spread across dozens of binders. "By noon," she repeated. He finally looked at her, his gray eyes cool and expectant. "Yes." "Problem?" Instead of answering, Claire smiled faintly. "None at all, though you might want to cancel lunch because your desk will be covered in paper by then." She left before he could respond, her calm steps hiding the storm in her chest. Back at her desk, she whispered to herself, "All right, Jonathan Steele, if you want a war of persistence, you'll get one." By mid-morning, the office was buzzing. Employees passed by her workstation, peeking at the mountain of files stacked beside her. Most expected to see panic. Instead, Claire had set up a small system with sticky notes, color-coded tabs, and even a timer that beeped every 20 minutes to keep her pace steady. Sandra from IT leaned close and whispered, "He gave you the archive, didn't he?" Claire only winked. "Let's just say I've got a date with 1,000 folders." Sandra shook her head in awe. "No one lasts a week with him. And you're smiling. Smiling keeps the papers in line." Claire replied. By 11:45, Jonathan's office door opened. He stepped into the hall, expecting to see chaos. What he saw instead stopped him mid-stride. Claire stood calmly, stacking the last binder on a neatly arranged shelf. Not only had she sorted every file by the ridiculous categories he'd demanded, alphabetical, chronological, relevance, she had gone further. She had created a side index organized by color and document thickness. She straightened, brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, and handed him a small summary sheet. "In case you ever need quick access." Jonathan took the sheet, scanning it with a face that revealed nothing. But behind his eyes, a thought stirred. She finished, and she improved it. The murmur of employees grew louder as word spread. They had expected tears, a resignation letter, maybe even a dramatic exit. Instead, Claire had turned an impossible order into a demonstration of competence. Jonathan dismissed her with a curt nod, though his jaw tightened as he closed the office door. Alone. He found himself irritated not because she had failed, but because she hadn't. And more unsettling still, part of him admired her for it. The next day, he tried again. At 9 sharp, he summoned her. "I need a detailed report on the third-floor staff's productivity," he ordered. "Charts, comparisons, hour by hour." Deadline 5 o'clock. Claire tilted her head. "Anything else?" "Yes." "One silver paperclip. Just one." She arched a brow. "Silver. Not gold. Not chrome. Silver," he repeated, savoring the absurdity. For a moment, Claire almost laughed, but instead, she nodded solemnly. Understood. A very important paperclip. By lunchtime, the sound of something metallic echoed from Jonathan's office. He opened the door and froze. His mahogany desk was buried beneath thousands of silver paperclips, glittering like coins under the fluorescent lights. Claire stood nearby, arms crossed, smiling with the calm satisfaction of a chess player declaring checkmate. "I wasn't sure which one you needed," she said sweetly, "so I brought every silver paperclip in the building. You can pick the best." Among the sea of clips lay the productivity report, neatly bound, complete with colorful charts. Jonathan's composure faltered for the briefest second. He stepped closer, picking up the report. It was immaculate, detailed, and annoyingly insightful. The data revealed that the third floor performed 20% better when they had decent coffee and light background music. He flipped through the pages, unwilling to admit he was impressed. Behind the glass walls, employees had gathered to watch, whispering, grinning. To them, this was theater, the secretary who dared to tease the untouchable CEO and somehow survived. Jonathan cleared his throat, his expression hardening again. "Tomorrow, I want this desk spotless, and regular coffee." Claire only nodded. "Of course, black or with cream." When she left, the office buzzed with laughter. Jonathan remained alone, staring at the shimmering pile of paperclips. His irritation was real, but so was the faint pull of curiosity. Who exactly was this woman who refused to bow by the end of the week? The whispers had shifted. "She's fearless." One intern said, "She's crazy." Another replied, "Or maybe," Sandra whispered with a grin, "she's exactly what this place needs." Jonathan heard these murmurs, and though he would never admit it, a strange unease gnawed at him. For years, his authority had been absolute, his word law. Now, one secretary calm, witty, impossible to intimidate was cracking the shell he had built. And deep down, where he rarely allowed himself to look, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: interest. The break room was never a place of laughter. At Steele Industries, it was more like a waiting room in a doctor's office, functional, silent, lined with humming machines that spat out bitter coffee and limp sandwiches wrapped in plastic. Claire had begun to notice things in these quiet corners, things the glossy hallways and expensive suits could not hide. The vending machine that once carried snacks until evening was always half empty by mid-afternoon. The refrigerator held more homemade lunches than store-bought ones, some of them carefully labeled with notes like, "Do not touch, this is my dinner too." That afternoon, she slipped into the break room between tasks. A few employees sat hunched over their lunches, shoulders slumped, voices hushed. Claire poured herself water and leaned against the counter, listening without meaning to. "They cut our commuter stipend again," a young analyst muttered, stabbing at his salad with a plastic fork. "I'm spending more on gas than I make in overtime." "At least you have overtime," another replied. "HR slashed ours last quarter. My wife and I are barely holding on with the mortgage." Claire didn't speak. She kept her expression neutral, but the words pressed against her chest like stones. She had expected tension, perhaps exhaustion, but this sounded like quiet despair. The door swung open, and in shuffled Martha, the evening janitor, though it was only 2 o'clock. She carried a rag in one hand and a small thermos in the other. Her back was slightly bent, her steps slow but steady. Her gray hair was pulled into a bun that had loosened with the day's work. "Afternoon. Miss Whitmore," Martha said with a gentle nod. She had a warm smile, the kind that softened her lined face. Claire smiled back. "Afternoon. Martha." "Taking a break." "Just for a moment," Martha said, lowering herself carefully into a chair. She unscrewed her thermos and poured tea into the lid, steam rising in a thin curl. "It's been a long week already." Claire hesitated, then sat beside her. "If you don't mind me asking, have things always been this hard here?" Martha chuckled, though the sound carried no joy. "Hard? No. Not always. I've been here 15 years. Used to be a decent job. Benefits were good. Health insurance even covered my glasses and dental." She sipped her tea slowly. "But 6 months ago, they cut the plan. Said it was to keep the company competitive. Now, we only get the basics." Her eyes flickered down at her hands, gnarled slightly with arthritis. "My doctor says I need cataract surgery. Without insurance, it'll cost more than I make in half a year. So, I keep working and waiting." The words sank deep into Claire's heart. She thought of Jonathan Steele's immaculate suits, the $1,000 shoes he wore as though they were nothing. And then she thought of Martha, carrying rags and a broken promise of health care. Claire lowered her voice. "Have people complained?" Martha gave a weary smile. "Complain to who?" To him, she tilted her chin toward the ceiling, toward the office above them, where Jonathan's empire loomed. "Mr. Steele doesn't hear people like us, and jobs aren't easy to find these days. Most of us can't afford to walk away. So we stay quiet." For the first time since she had started the job, Claire had no clever retort. She only placed a hand gently over Martha's. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Martha patted her hand softly, like a grandmother comforting a child. "You're sweet, dear. But don't get yourself in trouble over folks like us. We've learned to make do." That night, Claire lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling as the city hummed faintly outside her window. Sleep refused to come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Martha's face, heard the quiet resignation in her voice. She thought of the analyst with his gas receipts, the man worried about his mortgage, the refrigerator filled with do not touch notes. Her job had begun as a simple paycheck, a chance to prove herself after months of searching. She had told herself she could endure Jonathan's temper, his impossible tasks, even his cutting remarks. But this was different. This wasn't about spilled coffee or paper clips. This was about people's lives. She turned on her side, hugging her pillow. The safe thing, the smart thing, was to stay quiet, keep her head down, cash her paycheck, and go home. She had only been at Steele Industries a week. Who was she to stir the waters? But the thought of silence tasted bitter. Claire had grown up in a family that believed in fairness. Her father had been a mechanic, her mother a school teacher. They hadn't had much, But they had believed in dignity, that every person deserved to be seen, to be valued, to be treated with respect. Now, working inside this gleaming skyscraper, she saw how dignity had been stripped away, piece by piece, until even cataract surgery had become a luxury. She pressed her palms over her eyes, torn between two instincts, survival and justice. If I stay quiet, I keep my job. If I speak up, I might lose everything. Her heart pounded. Was she brave enough to choose the second path the city outside carried on, indifferent to her turmoil? But within her small apartment, Claire Whitmore fought a battle that would shape everything that came next. And though she didn't yet know it, the decision she wrestled with that sleepless night would ignite a fire Jonathan Steele had never expected to face, not from competitors, not from investors, but from the secretary who would not bow. On Monday morning, the 25th floor of Steele Industries smelled different, not of burnt coffee from the machine, nor of microwaved leftovers. Instead, a warm sweetness floated through the hallways, fresh pastries, buttery and golden, carried in boxes from a little bakery Claire had discovered on the corner of Wabash Avenue. She had risen before dawn, bundled herself against the chill, and convinced the baker to prepare 24 pastries and brew pots of real coffee. By 7:30, she was in the break room, arranging them on trays, each pastry paired with a handwritten note. Sandra from IT was the first to wander in, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She stopped in the doorway, blinking at the spread. "What's this?" Claire smiled, handing her a steaming cup. "Operation Morning Light. One day without bitter coffee and empty stomachs." Sandra picked up a croissant. A folded slip of paper was taped to the napkin. She read it aloud. "You're more than your deadlines. Thank you for keeping us connected." Her lips parted into a surprised laugh. "Claire, this is—" She didn't finish. Instead, she bit into the croissant, and the joy on her face said everything. Within minutes, word spread like wildfire. Analysts, interns, assistants all drifted toward the break room, lured by the aroma and the rare sound of laughter. They picked up pastries, reading the little notes tucked beside each one. "Your work matters, even when no one says it. You're the reason this place still runs. Don't forget you're more than an employee." James from accounting clutched his note like it was gold. "No one's ever written anything like this here," he murmured. Even Martha, the janitor, came in, her eyes watering when she read her message. "You make this building feel like home. You are seen." Someone turned on music quiet at first, then louder as more joined in. The sterile break room transformed into something unrecognizable, a space filled with chatter, laughter, the clinking of real mugs instead of styrofoam. For the first time since Claire had arrived, the office felt human. Jonathan Steele noticed the noise from down the hall. He stepped out of his office, irritation already tightening his jaw. Laughter, actual laughter, echoed through the corridor. He followed it to the break room, where the sight stopped him cold. His employees, usually stiff and silent, were gathered in clusters, smiling, joking, holding pastries in their hands like treasures. At the center of it all stood Claire, her improvised apron made from paper towels tied around her waist, pouring coffee as though she were hosting a neighborhood brunch. "What is this?" Jonathan's voice cut through the room. The laughter fell silent in an instant. Claire turned, still holding a tray. "Good morning, Mr. Steele. Pastry." He didn't answer. His eyes swept over the room, the food, the notes, the smiles, and what he saw felt dangerously close to rebellion. Whitmore, my office. Now. The air in his office was colder than the wind outside. Jonathan closed the door firmly behind them. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" His tone was sharp, clipped. "Breakfast?" Claire replied simply, setting the empty tray on his desk as though it were an exhibit, something the employees haven't had in a long time. "This isn't breakfast. This is disorder, distraction. I run a company, not a charity kitchen." Claire met his gaze steadily. "No, you run a company made of people, and people can't function like machines." His jaw clenched. "They're here to work, Not to be entertained, they're here to live, she countered softly. 8, 9, 10 hours a day. They give their energy to this place. And what do they get? Cuts to their benefits. Empty break rooms, silence in the halls. Do you even see them? Jonathan. The use of his first name startled him more than the words. Few dared to speak it aloud, let alone with such calm defiance. I see numbers, he snapped, and numbers don't lie. But they don't tell the whole truth either, Claire said. Her voice was steady, but her heart hammered. Numbers won't tell you that Martha can't afford her surgery, or that James worries about losing his home, or that your people come in every day already broken. Jonathan's breath hitched. For a moment, his mask cracked. Then he turned sharply toward the window, gripping the sill as though the skyline might steady him. You presume too much, he said finally. No, Claire answered, softer now. I see what you refuse to look at. Silence stretched between them. The hum of the city below filled the room. Jonathan's reflection in the glass looked rigid, carved in stone. Finally, he turned back, eyes colder than before. You're walking a dangerous line, Miss Whitmore. Remember your place. Claire lifted her chin. I know my place. It's beside the people who make this company possible. And if that bothers you, she paused, gathering her courage, then maybe the problem isn't me. The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Jonathan's lips parted, as if to unleash the fury his reputation promised. But no words came. He only stared at her, a storm raging in his silence. Claire turned, opened the door, and walked out without waiting to be dismissed. In the hall, employees looked up from their desks. Some eyes widened in fear, others in admiration. No one spoke, but the message was clear. The secretary had stood against Jonathan Steele, and somehow, she was still standing. That night, long after the office had emptied, Jonathan remained in his chair, the pastry tray still on his desk. He picked up one of the notes Claire had left behind, written in her careful hand, You can choose to be feared, or you can choose to be respected. He crushed the paper in his fist, but the words would not leave him. The boardroom on the 30th floor gleamed with polished mahogany and glass. It was the kind of room designed to impress heavy chairs, a skyline view, the faint scent of leather and cologne. On this morning, it was filled with the quiet tension of money at stake. Jonathan Steele stood at the head of the table, immaculate in a navy suit, posture as sharp as the creases in his trousers. Across from him sat three of the firm's largest investors, men and women who could decide the company's future with a signature. Claire, carrying a tray of fresh coffee, slipped into the room quietly. She wasn't meant to stay. Her role was simply to serve and disappear. But something in her gut told her to linger, to listen. Jonathan clicked a remote, and the screen behind him lit up with charts and figures. His voice carried the smooth confidence of a man who had mastered performance. As you can see, he said, gesturing to the projection, Steel Industries closed the last quarter with a 15% growth margin across all divisions. Efficiency has never been higher. Our cost-cutting strategies are working exactly as planned. The investors nodded, murmuring approval. Margaret Lancaster, a sharp-eyed woman with silver hair pulled into a bun, scribbled notes on her tablet. Thomas Whitaker, older, spectacles balanced on his nose, adjusted in his chair. Claire poured the last cup of coffee and stepped back. She glanced at the chart, her brow furrowing. Something didn't add up. She remembered the finance reports she'd reviewed just yesterday while filing. The decimals, the totals. The numbers weren't 15%. They were closer to 12. Her pulse quickened. She told herself to stay quiet. This wasn't her place. She was a secretary, not an analyst. But silence pressed on her chest until it became unbearable. She cleared her throat. "Excuse me, Mr. Steele," she said softly. The room froze. Jonathan turned slowly, his expression unreadable, though his eyes burned with warning. "Miss Whitmore," he said through clenched teeth. "This is not the time." Claire forced herself to breathe steadily. I believe there's a mistake in the numbers. A ripple of surprise moved through the investors. Thomas tilted his head, intrigued. Margaret set her pen down. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Elaborate, he said, his voice like ice. Claire stepped forward, holding a folder she had brought instinctively. Yesterday, I reviewed the finance department's raw reports. The growth margin isn't 15%. It's 12.3. The difference comes from rounding decimals in the third quarter totals. When you add them, the result inflates the outcome. She laid the folder on the table and opened it, revealing neatly arranged charts in color. Here, if you separate by department and adjust for error margins, this is the accurate growth rate. Margaret leaned in, scanning the charts. Thomas adjusted his spectacles, studying each line, one by one. Their expressions shifted from polite detachment to genuine interest. Are these calculations correct? Thomas asked. Yes, Claire said firmly. I spent hours double-checking them. Silence hung heavy. Jonathan's hands curled on the table. He could feel his authority slipping, the polished performance unraveling in front of him. He had built his empire on control, on perfection. And here was his secretary dismantling it with nothing but honesty and a steady voice. Finally, Margaret spoke. I appreciate transparency, Mr. Steele. Inflated numbers may please the eye, but they don't build trust. She tapped Claire's folder lightly. This is the kind of report I expect from a company worth my investment. Jonathan's face remained impassive, but inside, something twisted, rage, humiliation, and though he despised the thought, an ember of admiration, she had risked everything to speak truth in a room where no one else dared. Thomas chuckled suddenly, breaking the tension. Remarkable. In 30 years of meetings, I've never seen a secretary correct a CEO with such grace. Either you promote her, steal, or I might steal her for my own firm. The investors laughed softly. Jonathan forced a smile, though it felt like swallowing glass. She has a talent for details, he said. Claire closed the folder calmly. I only believe that honesty serves better than exaggeration. Numbers don't lie unless people make them. Her words landed like stones in still water. The meeting pressed on, but Jonathan barely heard it. His mind reeled with conflicting thoughts. She had embarrassed him in front of the most powerful people in the room, and yet she had also saved him. If the investors had discovered the error themselves, the damage would have been far worse. As the investors shook hands and left, Margaret paused by Claire. Keep speaking up, she said quietly. This company needs more people like you. Claire thanked her with a small nod. When the room emptied, only she and Jonathan remained. For a long moment, silence. Jonathan leaned against the table, staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. His voice, when it came, was low, rougher than usual. You made me look like a fool today. Claire met his gaze. Or, I made you look honest. His lips pressed into a thin line. He wanted to argue, to reassert control, but instead, he found himself searching her face, as though she were a puzzle he couldn't solve. Finally, he exhaled sharply, straightening his suit jacket. Get back to work. Claire left the room with her head held high, her steps steady despite the tremor in her chest. She didn't know if she had just signed her own termination slip, but one thing was clear. The tide within Steele Industries had shifted, and Jonathan Steele, furious, humiliated, and unwillingly impressed, would never look at her the same way again. It was close to midnight when Jonathan Steele finally admitted defeat. The office was silent, but for the hum of the heating system and the low rumble of the city below. Papers were scattered across his desk ledgers, bank statements, files stamped confidential. For years, he had prided himself on control. His numbers were always precise, his empire tightly run. But tonight, the numbers betrayed him. A federal audit had been announced. Whispers of tax irregularities, allegations of hidden accounts. It was the kind of storm that could wreck not just his company, but his reputation, his entire legacy. Jonathan rubbed his temples, exhaustion dragging at him. He had spent hours combing through spreadsheets, but something was wrong. Transfers didn't match. Accounts appeared and vanished like shadows. He was missing something, something vital. And that was the part that unsettled him most. He couldn't see the whole picture. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt something dangerously close to fear. The next morning, Claire arrived to find an envelope waiting on her desk. Inside was a single note, written in Jonathan's sharp, angular script, conference room, 8:00 a.m. When she entered, she found him already there, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened. Stacks of binders lay open across the long table. His eyes, bloodshot but still sharp, lifted to hers. "Close the door," he said. She obeyed, then waited. "We have a problem," Jonathan began. His voice was low, almost hoarse. "The federal auditors believe we've hidden taxable income through shell accounts. If we can't prove otherwise within 72 hours, Steele Industries is finished." Claire's brows furrowed. "Tax fraud. Is it true?" His jaw tightened. "No, but someone wants it to look that way. Transfers have been manipulated. Files don't add up. There's a leak inside this company." He gestured to the mountain of paperwork. "I've been over this a dozen times. I can't find the pattern." Claire crossed her arms. "So, why are you telling me?" Jonathan's gaze locked on hers. For a long moment, silence stretched between them. He hated the words that rose in his throat, but he had no choice. "Because you notice things I don't," he said quietly. "You see the cracks no one else sees. And right now, I need that." Claire studied him. This was not the commanding CEO who barked orders and demanded obedience. His voice held something foreign, something close to vulnerability. "You're asking me to audit your own company." She asked. "I'm asking you to help me save it," Jonathan replied. His eyes did not waver. She let the weight of his words sink in. He was putting his empire, his name, his survival into her hands. And yet, a flicker of defiance rose in her. She thought of Martha with her cataracts, of employees scraping by on cut benefits. This man, who wore $1,000 suits while others suffered, was asking her for help. "Why me?" she pressed. "Because you're the only one here I know isn't involved. And," he hesitated, almost choking on the admission, "because I trust you." Claire felt the air shift. For weeks, she had battled him in small skirmishes, coffee, paper clips, pastries, numbers. Now, here he was, stripped of armor, but she wasn't going to make it easy. "All right," she said at last. "I'll help." Jonathan exhaled, relief flickering in his eyes. "But," Claire added, her voice steady, "on one condition." His brows knitted. "What condition?" "You have to say it. Say what the magic word," she said. "Please." For a moment, silence. Jonathan's expression was caught somewhere between disbelief and offense. He had commanded boardrooms, bent competitors to his will, dismissed employees with a flick of his hand. He had never begged. "Whitmore," his voice warned. She didn't flinch. "If you want my help, Jonathan, you have to step off that throne of yours. Just this once. Say it." The clock ticked on the wall. Jonathan's jaw clenched so tightly she thought it might crack. He turned away, staring at the city skyline as though it could give him strength. But when he turned back, she saw at the faintest crack in his pride. His voice dropped low, almost a whisper. "Please." Claire tilted her head. "Didn't catch that." His nostrils flared. "Please," he said louder, the word tasting foreign, bitter on his tongue. "Please, Claire, will you help me?" Her lips curved into the faintest smile. Now, that wasn't so hard. Was it? Jonathan let out a breath that sounded almost like surrender. And just like that, the war between them shifted. No longer mere defiance, no longer petty challenges. Something deeper had begun, an alliance born not of choice, but of necessity. That night, as they pored over files side by side, Jonathan found himself stealing glances at her. the way her brow furrowed when she concentrated, the way her fingers moved quickly across the calculator, jotting notes with precision. For years, he had relied on no one but himself. Yet, here she was, steady as stone, refusing to yield, refusing to fear, and against his will. He felt it something loosening in his chest. For the first time in his life, Jonathan Steele needed someone, and the someone was Claire Whitmore. The conference room was littered with papers, empty coffee cups, and the faint fatigue of two people who hadn't slept properly in days. Claire sat at one end of the long table, cross-checking transaction histories, while Jonathan leaned over the other, sleeves rolled high, tie tossed aside, his jaw shadowed with stubble. Hours had passed in silence, broken only by the scratch of pens and the shuffle of documents. They had begun to fall into rhythm. He searched. She double-checked, then cross-referenced. Yet beneath that quiet teamwork lay something heavier, something Claire couldn't quite name. Just after midnight, Claire reached for a file buried under a stack marked Private. The cover was faded, the leather worn. She frowned. This doesn't look like financial records. Jonathan, bent over his laptop, didn't glance up. Leave it. Irrelevant. But curiosity tugged at her. She opened it carefully. Inside were newspaper clippings, old photographs, and handwritten notes in a script that didn't match Jonathan's usual sharp precision. The first clipping caught her breath. Steel magnate Henry Steele announces record-breaking quarter, praises efficiency of workforce. The date was nearly 35 years ago. Below it, a photograph of a boy, 7 or 8, standing stiffly in a velvet blazer. His expression was solemn, his eyes hauntingly familiar. Claire's gaze flicked to Jonathan. His hair was darker now, jaw sharper, but those eyes the same gray, the same unyielding stare. "Is this you?" she asked gently. Jonathan stiffened. His hand froze on the keyboard. "I told you it's irrelevant." She ignored the warning in his voice, flipping another page. This one showed the boy again, older, beside a woman in pearls. The caption read, "Steele family attends charity gala." But what struck Claire wasn't the wealth or the glamour. It was the boy's expression, lonely, almost hollow, while his parents smiled for cameras. She closed the folder halfway, her voice softer now. "You grew up in this, the empire before the empire." Jonathan finally looked at her, eyes hard, put it away. But she didn't. She held his gaze instead. "Your childhood. It wasn't easy. Was it?" His laugh was short, bitter. "Easy, I had everything money could buy. Mansions, tutors, vacations. Everything except what mattered." His hand clenched into a fist. "My father believed weakness was failure. Emotion was weakness. I learned very young that being seen meant being judged, so I stopped trying." Claire's heart ached. She thought of the employees who feared him, the silence that hung over the office. Of course he ruled with coldness. He had been raised in it. "Jonathan," she began. "Don't." He cut in sharply. His voice was rough, almost pleading. "Don't pity me." "I don't," she said quietly. I understand." Something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of surprise, maybe even vulnerability. No one had ever said that to him before. Claire closed the file gently, sliding it toward him. The past doesn't vanish just because you bury it under ledgers. It bleeds through, into how you lead, into how people see you, into who you've become. Jonathan turned away, staring at the skyline through the glass wall. His reflection looked like the boy in the photograph, trapped in a suit too big for his frame. "People respect strength," he said finally. "People respect humanity more," Claire countered softly. "Strength without compassion is just fear, and fear doesn't last forever." Silence stretched. The only sound was the faint ticking of the wall clock. For the first time since she had met him, Jonathan Steele didn't look like the untouchable CEO. He looked like a man flawed, scarred, still carrying the loneliness of a boy who had been told never to cry. Claire reached across the table, her hand brushing his for the briefest second. It wasn't bold, Wasn't romantic, it was simply human. You don't have to carry it alone anymore, she whispered. Jonathan's eyes met hers. Gray storm meeting calm harbor. He didn't pull away, but he didn't move closer either. He only nodded, barely, as though testing what it felt like to accept, not command, not demand, accept. And in that fragile pause, something cracked in him, not broken, not destroyed, just opened. The next day, as they returned to the mountain of financial files, Jonathan was quieter, less biting with his orders. He even fetched coffee for both of them, though he placed it on the table without a word, as if afraid to acknowledge the gesture. Employees noticed a difference too. His glare wasn't as sharp in the hallways. His silence no longer thundered as loudly. It was small, tentative, almost imperceptible. But change had begun, and though Jonathan Steele would never admit it, it had started the moment Claire Whitmore touched the past he had spent his life trying to bury. The morning sun filtered through the tall glass windows of Steele Industries, but it did nothing to warm the atmosphere inside. Rumors rippled through the upper floors. Federal auditors had found irregularities too specific to be accidents. Someone inside the company had been feeding false information into the books. Jonathan sat stiffly at the head of the conference table, jaw clenched, eyes locked on the spreadsheet spread before him. Across from him, Claire read each line with meticulous care. She circled numbers, drew arrows, whispered connections under her breath. At last, she leaned back. These payments, $25,000 a month to an entity called Westmark Consulting. No office, no employees, just a P.O. box in Delaware. Jonathan's voice was low. A shell company. Claire nodded, and whoever approved the transfers had access only senior executives share. Jonathan exhaled sharply, which narrows it to 3 people: myself, Robert Hayes, or Jennifer Calloway. Jennifer was the COO, a sharp woman with 20 years of loyalty behind her name. Claire shook her head. The paper trail doesn't match her authorizations. She signs digitally. Her logins are too clean. This, she tapped the page, has Robert Hayes written all over it. Jonathan's face hardened. Robert Hayes, his CFO, his right-hand man for nearly a decade, the man he'd trusted to keep the empire steady. Hayes has been with me since before I took the chair, Jonathan muttered. He was at my side when we built this company. He knows everything. Claire watched him carefully. That's exactly why he could do this. He knows where the weaknesses are. Jonathan's silence was heavy, and Claire could see the battle in his eyes. Trust versus betrayal, loyalty versus evidence. Jonathan, she said gently, if we don't act, this company goes under, not because of the auditors, but because of him. We need to catch him in the act. His gaze flicked to her, storm gray, weighed down by pride and a reluctant need for her clarity. And how do you suggest we do that? Claire opened a fresh folder, sliding it toward him. We set a trap. Create a file with just enough tempting numbers to sell falsified projections, disguised as confidential, then leave it where Hayes can't resist. If he leaks it, we'll know. Jonathan frowned. You want me to bait my own CFO like a criminal in some cheap sting? Claire held her ground. Yes, because right now, the evidence is circumstantial. The auditors don't care about your history with him. They need proof. And if we don't find it, Steele Industries becomes another headline: Millionaire CEO indicted for fraud. Her words cut sharper than she intended, but they landed. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Damn it, Claire. I built this company with men like Hayes. If he's dirty... His voice faltered, quieter than she'd ever heard. Then maybe I've been blind all along. Claire's tone softened. Or maybe you trusted the wrong person. That doesn't make you blind. It makes you human. For a moment, their eyes met. His pride battled his vulnerability, and she could feel the weight of his history pressing against the present. Finally, Jonathan straightened, resolve hardening. All right, we do it your way. But if this goes wrong, it won't. She cut in, calm and steady, because we'll plan every detail. That night, the office was nearly empty when Claire drafted the bait, a file labeled Strategic Expansion Report 2024, with projections so inflated they glowed like neon. The numbers promised impossible growth, enough to tempt anyone eager to exploit them. Jonathan stood over her shoulder, watching the screen. "It looks real. It has to," she replied. "Auditors will see it as bait, but Hayes won't. His greed will blind him." He studied her, not the file. "And what blinds you?" "Claire." She turned slightly, meeting his gaze. "Justice. The people downstairs who lost their benefits. Martha working 2 shifts just to pay for medication. This isn't just about catching Hayes. It's about giving them back what they deserve." Jonathan said nothing, but his silence felt less like dismissal and more like reluctant agreement. When the file was saved, Claire placed it into Hayes' shared drive, labeling it as restricted. She printed a hard copy, slipped it into a red folder, and left it on Jonathan's desk with his signature scrawled across the cover, a detail Hayes would never question. "Tomorrow," Jonathan said grimly. "We wait." The next day, tension wrapped around the office like a wire pulled too tight. Claire moved through the halls with calm precision, but her heart thudded in her chest. Every time she passed Hayes, she watched his hands, his eyes, the way he lingered near Jonathan's office door. By noon, the red folder was gone. Jonathan's jaw tightened when he found his desk empty. He took it. "Now we let him run with it," Claire said, steadying him. "The FBI's already monitoring communications. If he shares it, they'll know." Jonathan nodded, but his face betrayed turmoil. Claire could see it, the sting of betrayal colliding with his instinct to believe in loyalty. That night, as the office emptied, they waited in silence. At 9:37 p.m., Jonathan's phone buzzed, a single message from the FBI contact. He's transmitting now. Jonathan's hand shook as he set the phone down. For a man known for control, the tremor was telling. Claire spoke softly. "It's over. He'll be caught." Jonathan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to the window, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. "I trusted him with everything." His voice cracked on the last word. Claire stepped closer, her voice calm but firm. "Trust isn't weakness, Jonathan. Betrayal is. That's on him, not you." He looked at her then, as though seeing her not just as an employee, not even as the woman who had challenged him, but as the only person who could stand in the wreckage of his trust and hold steady. For the first time, he whispered the truth aloud. "I don't know if I can do this alone." Claire didn't flinch. "Then don't. You don't have to." That night, Steele Industries held its breath. The empire Jonathan built was under siege, not from outside rivals, but from the rot within. Yet, in the quiet of his office, with Claire beside him, Jonathan realized something unsettling and perhaps liberating. The strength he'd always believed came from control might, in fact, come from trust. And trust, for him, had just begun to wear a new face. The invitation gleamed under the chandelier light in Jonathan's office, embossed in gold, sealed with the insignia of the Ashford Foundation. An annual gala, champagne, orchestras, politicians, and the city's wealthiest gathered under one roof. It was the kind of event Jonathan usually commanded with ease, but this year it carried something darker. The FBI suspected the shell companies were laundering money through charity auctions, and Robert Hayes' name, once a cornerstone of trust, was scribbled across donation ledgers in faint but undeniable ink. Jonathan turned the invitation over in his hands. The auditors need eyes inside, and apparently, so do we. Claire, standing near his desk with arms folded, tilted her head. "And you want me to be those eyes?" Jonathan's mouth pressed into a line. "Not just you, us. They expect couples at this gala. Hayes will be there. If we want him to slip, we have to blend in." The word couple hung heavy between them. Claire let out a small, disbelieving laugh. "So, Let me get this straight. You, the man whose idea of small talk is a nod in the hallway, want me to play your charming date for an entire evening." Jonathan's eyes narrowed, but there was no bite in his tone. "Consider it another impossible task. You've handled those before." Saturday night arrived with a chill in the autumn air. Claire stood in front of the grand mirror of her modest apartment, fastening the final clasp of a deep navy gown she had borrowed from a friend. She hardly recognized herself. The woman in the glass looked poised, elegant, maybe even radiant. But inside, her chest twisted with nerves. This was supposed to be a mission. Nothing more. She whispered to her reflection, almost like a reminder. It's just a role. It's just work. A knock at the door. She opened it to find Jonathan, for once stripped of his dark armor of black suits. Tonight he wore a tailored tuxedo, sharp but softened by a pale silk tie. For a heartbeat, Claire simply stared. He looked human, almost approachable. His eyes flicked over her, then lingered. "You clean up well, Whitmore. And you don't look half as terrifying without that villain tie," she replied, forcing a teasing edge to cover the flutter in her chest. The Ashford estate glowed like something out of a dream. Crystal chandeliers spilled light across marble floors. Violins hummed from the balcony, and servers floated with trays of champagne. Couples glided through the room, laughing with the ease of people who had never worried about bills or broken benefits. Jonathan offered his arm stiffly. Claire hesitated, then slipped her hand through. To anyone watching, they looked the part of a perfect pair. But beneath her calm smile, Claire's mind was racing. She could feel the warmth of his sleeve under her palm, the steadiness of his stride beside hers. "Relax," Jonathan murmured, low enough that only she could hear. "Easy for you to say," she whispered back. "You were born in places like this." His jaw tightened. Born in them. Yes, belonging to them. That's another story. Claire glanced at him, surprised at the confession, but before she could respond, a booming voice interrupted. Jonathan Steele, a senator with a too-wide grin, clapped him on the back. "And who is this vision at your side?" Jonathan didn't miss a beat. He pulled Claire closer, his hand settling at the small of her back, the gesture proprietary yet strangely protective. "This is Claire Whitmore, my partner, not secretary, not assistant." The word rattled in her chest. She smiled, shook the senator's hand, and played the role. Hours passed in a blur of conversations. Jonathan spoke with investors, dignitaries, even a judge. Claire listened, observed, catching details he might miss the names dropped too casually, the glances exchanged too quickly. And there, near the champagne tower, was Robert Hayes, laughing with men she didn't recognize, his hand brushing the cufflink at his wrist as though it were a signal. Claire leaned closer to Jonathan, her lips near his ear. "He's here, and he's working something." Jonathan didn't move, but his grip on her hand tightened. "Stay close." They circled the room like dancers in a game of masks. To everyone else, they were just another elegant couple, but beneath the facade, they were hunting. Then it happened. Hayes slipped a flash drive into the hand of a man in a gray suit. The exchange so fast it could have been mistaken for a polite handshake. Claire's eyes caught it. She leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've got him!" Jonathan turned his head slightly, his cheek brushing hers as he answered. "Not yet. We need evidence it's the data. Wait." For a moment, their closeness was more than strategy. Claire felt the heat of his breath, the steadiness of his presence. The masquerade blurred, just for an instant, into something dangerously real. Later, when they stepped onto the balcony for air, the city lights sprawling below them, Claire pulled away, needing distance. "This is getting complicated," she murmured. Jonathan looked at her, puzzled. "The case, no, this," she gestured between them. "We're supposed to be pretending, but tell me, Jonathan, is this still an act for you?" His silence was louder than words. Claire shook her head, half angry at herself. "I can't afford to get lost in this. Not when people's jobs, their lives, Depend on me staying clear." He stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "You think I don't fight the same battle? You think I don't know what's at stake?" Their eyes locked, neither backing down. And for a heartbeat, the gala's music, the city's hum, the entire world fell away. Claire turned first, gripping the balcony rail. "This is work. It has to be." Jonathan's expression softened, but there was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before, something almost tender. "Then, let's do the work. Together." Inside, the violins swelled and the masquerade continued. But as they re-entered the ballroom, arm in arm, Claire couldn't shake the question echoing in her chest. Was she still acting, or was this the beginning of something she wasn't ready to name? The morning after the gala, the office felt like the silence before a storm. Every executive walked the halls with forced smiles, but the tension was thick enough to taste. Jonathan and Claire sat in the glass-walled conference room, the blinds half drawn, waiting for the call that would seal everything. At precisely 9:14 a.m., Jonathan's phone buzzed. He snatched it up, his knuckles white. The FBI agent's voice was crisp. "We've got the transfer." Hayes handed off a flash drive to our operative. "The files are loaded with falsified accounts. He's finished." Jonathan ended the call, lowering the phone slowly as though it weighed 100 pounds. Claire leaned forward, searching his face. "It's done." He nodded once. His voice was flat. "He's guilty." By noon, Robert Hayes was escorted into Jonathan's office under the guise of a routine meeting. He walked in confident, smiling as though the world was still in his control. He even clasped Jonathan on the shoulder. "You wanted to see me." Old friend Jonathan didn't return the gesture. He sat behind his desk, his expression carved from stone. Claire stood to the side, a silent witness, her arms crossed but her eyes watchful. Jonathan slid a red folder across the desk. "Recognize this?" Hayes flipped it open, feigning nonchalance. "Strategic Expansion Report. Looks like one of the projections we've been kicking around." Jonathan's voice dropped lower. "Funny. Because that report was never supposed to leave this office." For the first time, Hayes' eyes flickered, a crack in the mask. "What are you implying?" Claire stepped forward, her tone calm but sharp. "We know. Robert, the flash drive, the transfers, the shell accounts, it's all traced back to you." Hayes laughed nervously. "Preposterous. Jonathan, you don't actually believe this, do you? We've built this company together, you and me. Remember the early days when everyone doubted you? I was the one who stood by your side." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "And now you're the one who tried to tear it down." Hayes leaned across the desk, his voice pleading. "Listen to me. You can spin this. Blame it on bad bookkeeping, a junior accountant. No one has to know. We can bury it, Jonathan, just like we buried mistakes before." The room went dead quiet. Claire's stomach knotted. She looked at Jonathan, saw the flicker in his eyes, pain, betrayal, the temptation of denial, the ghost of loyalty wrestling with the truth. At last, Jonathan stood. His voice was iron. "Get out of my office. The agents are waiting for you downstairs." Hayes' face drained of color. "You wouldn't." Jonathan leaned forward, every word precise. "I would, because this company will survive without you, but I won't let it rot with you inside it." Security appeared at the door, and Hayes was let out, his protests echoing down the hall. The entire floor went silent as they watched him pass. When the door finally closed, Jonathan sank into his chair. For the first time in years, he looked smaller, as though the weight of betrayal had stolen inches from his height. Claire approached cautiously. "You did the right thing." His hands were clasped tightly together, his eyes fixed on the floor. "He was my friend, the only one I had when I started all this. Do you have any idea what it feels like to find out that the only person you trusted was chiseling away at you the whole time?" Claire pulled a chair close, sitting across from him. Her voice softened. Yes. It feels like the ground isn't safe anymore. Like every memory you thought was solid crumbles when you touch it. He finally looked at her, and she saw it, pain etched into every line of his face. But behind the pain, there was something else. Fear. I built walls, he admitted, his voice breaking. I kept everyone out because I thought loyalty meant safety, and Hayes was the one person I let in. Now, his voice caught, now, I don't know if I can trust anyone again. Claire reached across the desk, laying her hand gently over his clenched fists. Her touch was steady, grounding. You don't have to trust everyone. Just start with one person. Their eyes held, the room so quiet she could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Jonathan's breathing slowed, his shoulders easing ever so slightly under her gaze. You're not alone in this, Claire whispered. Not anymore. The rest of the office buzzed with whispers, employees peeking over cubicle walls, sharing theories in hushed voices. The mighty Robert Hayes, taken out in broad daylight, escorted by federal agents. It was the kind of scandal that would shake any empire, but inside Jonathan's office, there was no noise. Just two people, sitting across from each other, realizing that the battle wasn't just about ledgers and fraud, it was about loneliness, trust, and the fragile hope of connection. Jonathan closed his eyes for a long moment, then exhaled. When he opened them, there was still grief, but also resolve. The company will recover. It has to. But me? He trailed off, then shook his head. I don't know what recovery looks like. Claire squeezed his hand gently. Maybe it looks like starting fresh, with honesty, with people who won't use you. He studied her, as if weighing every word. And you think you're one of those people? Her lips curved faintly, bittersweet. I know I am. For the first time all day, a ghost of a smile tugged at his mouth, small, fleeting, but real. That night, after the building emptied, Jonathan lingered in his office. The city glowed outside the windows, but he didn't see it. He replayed Robert's words, their history, the betrayal. And yet, over the noise of memory, one truth cut clear when the walls had collapsed. Claire had been there, not as an employee, not even as a strategist, but as someone who refused to let him drown alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to begin again. The week after Robert Hayes' downfall was a blur. Steele Industries was still standing, but barely. Meetings stretched past midnight. Auditors combed through records, and tension clung to the air like dust after a collapse. Jonathan moved like a shadow through the office, controlled, stern, but thinner somehow, as though betrayal had carved a hollow inside him. For Claire, the days were just as heavy. She fielded calls, drafted memos, reassured employees whose faith had been shaken, but every night, as she walked home through the quiet streets, a question followed her like an echo. How much longer can I carry this weight? It was on a rainy Thursday that Andrew Carter first appeared. She noticed him even before Jennifer from reception announced his name. A man in his mid-30s, tall, with the kind of presence that didn't shout for attention, but drew it nonetheless. His suit was impeccable, but his smile carried warmth rather than intimidation. When his eyes met Claire's across the lobby, they didn't appraise her the way so many powerful men's did. They acknowledged her as though she mattered. Miss Whitmore. His voice was smooth, steady. Andrew Carter, Carter Capital. May I have a moment of your time? Claire blinked, caught off guard. I'm Jonathan Steele's secretary. I know. Andrew replied, his smile deepening. That's why I came. But I'd like to speak with you not as Steele's employee, but as yourself. They sat in the corner of a nearby cafe, the kind with rain streaking the windows and steam rising from mugs of strong coffee. Andrew folded his hands across the table, looking at her with direct sincerity. I'll be blunt, he began. Word travels fast in this city. I've heard about what you did, how you uncovered discrepancies, stood up to Hayes, even helped keep Steele Industries from collapsing. Claire frowned. That was a team effort. Maybe. Andrew said. But every story I've heard begins with your name. People talk about Steele, yes, but they talk about you with respect. And frankly, I think you're wasting your brilliance as someone's secretary. Claire shifted in her seat. It's not as simple as that. Andrew nodded, as though he expected resistance. Then he slid a slim envelope across the table. Inside was a formal letter. Executive Director. Corporate Strategy. Carter Capital. A salary several times her current pay. Benefits fully restored, and then a promise of autonomy, authority, respect. Claire's breath caught. This is a chance. Andrew finished for her. To lead. To make the kind of impact you've been making in the shadows, but openly, with resources, with recognition, and without being dismissed as the woman who spilled coffee on a CEO's suit. Her cheeks flushed at the reminder, though his tone carried no mockery. That night, alone in her apartment, Claire set the letter on her kitchen table and stared at it. The rain outside beat against the glass, each drop like the tick of a clock measuring her hesitation. 3 times the salary, health insurance, retirement, stability, respect, right from the start. And yet, she saw Martha's tired smile when she handed her a warm pastry. She heard Brian's laughter the day the stapler finally worked. She remembered Jonathan, shoulders slumped, whispering, "I don't know if I can do this alone." Her chest ached. With Andrew, there would be no war, no impossible tasks, no biting sarcasm masking vulnerability, only clarity and a seat at the table she'd earned. With Jonathan, there was chaos, struggle. A man who infuriated her, challenged her, but who against her better judgment had become someone she couldn't stop caring about. She closed her eyes and whispered into the quiet. What am I really fighting for? The job? The man or the people who depend on both? The next morning, she carried the weight of the decision into the office. Jonathan was already there, leaning over spreadsheets, his tie loosened in a way she rarely saw. He looked up when she entered. You're early. So are you. Their eyes held a beat too long before Claire looked away. Setting down her bag, she wanted to tell him everything: the offer, the letter, the temptation. But the words stuck. Because how could she explain that another man saw her worth instantly, while Jonathan had taken weeks just to treat her as more than an inconvenience? Instead, she busied herself with files. Claire, Jonathan said suddenly, his voice quieter. Yesterday, I nearly called Hayes by his first name when the agents took him away. I almost begged them to let him go, even after everything. She turned, surprised by his candor. Do you know what stopped me? His gaze was sharp, but vulnerable. You reminded me I wasn't alone. Her throat tightened. The letter in her bag seemed to burn through the leather. That evening, Andrew called. His tone was gentle but confident. Have you thought about my offer? Claire stood by her apartment window, the city glittering beneath her. Yes, I have. And her silence stretched. In that silence lived every contradiction: the desire for stability, the loyalty to people who needed her, the complicated pull of a man who both infuriated and inspired her. Finally, she said softly, I'm not ready to answer. Not yet. Andrew didn't press. Take your time, but Claire, don't let someone else's shadow keep you from stepping into your own light. When the call ended, she set the phone down, her heart a storm. Was she staying at Steele Industries for the job, for the employees who looked at her as their hope, or for Jonathan, whose guarded eyes now lingered on her with something she was afraid to name? The letter lay unopened on her desk, and she knew sooner or later, temptation would demand her answer. The boardroom gleamed with polished wood and cold light, but the energy inside was anything but orderly. Jonathan had called for an early meeting with investors, his tone clipped, his eyes sharper than usual. Claire sat at the far end, taking notes, quietly observing as numbers flashed across the projection screen. The double doors opened midway, and Andrew Carter entered, smooth as ever. His presence drew a stir among the board members, young, confident, representing a wave of new money. Jonathan's eyes flicked toward him, narrowing. "Mr. Carter," Jonathan said coolly. "You're late." Andrew only smiled. "Traffic. But I think the company can survive 5 minutes without me." Light laughter rippled around the table. Jonathan didn't join. After the presentation ended, investors drifted into small groups. Claire gathered the reports when she felt a shadow beside her. "Andrew, you were sharp today," he said warmly. "Your points about employee morale, you made them listen. That's rare in a room like this." Claire smiled faintly. "I only said what needed saying, and that's exactly why you stand out." His voice dropped lower. "Have you thought more about my offer?" She hesitated. "I have, but it's complicated." Andrew studied her carefully. "It doesn't have to be. Sometimes, the right choice is the one that lets you breathe freely." Before she could respond, Jonathan's voice cut through like a blade. "Claire." She turned. He stood a few steps away, jaw tight, fists clenched at his sides. The board members had left, leaving the three of them in the cavernous room. His eyes burned, not with businesslike precision, but with something far more dangerous. "Step into my office," he said. His office door slammed shut behind them. The silence was electric, the city skyline glaring through the glass. Jonathan spun toward her, his composure cracked. "What were you doing with him?" Claire set the reports on the desk, forcing calm into her voice. "Talking about work, about options." "Options?" His voice rose. "Options that involve leaving this company. Leaving me." Her heart thudded. "Jonathan, you don't own me. My life. My choices, they're mine." He paced, running a hand through his hair. "You don't understand? That man Carter, he wants more than your talent. He wants you. And you stand there smiling at him, like what?" Claire snapped, her voice breaking. "Like a woman who deserves to be valued, who deserves respect without having to fight for every scrap of it." Jonathan froze. Her words hit harder than he expected. "You've tested me since the first day," Claire continued, her tone trembling but fierce. "Coffee, paper clips, impossible deadlines, and I stood my ground. But don't mistake that for belonging to you. I am not yours to command." "Jonathan!" He stepped closer, desperation breaking through his pride. "You think this is about command, Claire? His voice cracked, raw. "I can't lose you." The words hung heavy, stunning them both. For the first time, Jonathan Steele, the man who never admitted weakness, had confessed need. Claire's chest tightened, torn between anger and the ache in his voice. "You can't lose me, Jonathan. You never even had me." "Not really." He flinched, as though struck. Her eyes glistened, but her voice was steady. "I came here to do a job, to help people who needed someone to fight for them. And somewhere along the way, I got pulled into your storm. But I won't drown in it. Not for you. Not for anyone." Jonathan's hand twitched at his side, as though he wanted to reach for her, but pride and fear held him back. "Claire." His voice was hoarse. "Don't walk away." She shook her head, her throat tight. "Then give me a reason to stay that isn't about your empire, or your fear of being alone. Give me a reason that's real." Silence. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The man who always had an answer stood speechless, undone by the woman before him. Claire's breath hitched. She turned, gripping the door handle. "Until then, Jonathan, I don't belong to you." And with that, she walked out, leaving him in the vast emptiness of his office. Jonathan stood frozen, staring at the door long after it closed. The city lights flickered against the glass behind him, but he saw nothing. For years, he had ruled with certainty, wielded power like armor, and now, for the first time, he realized power meant nothing if it couldn't hold the one person who mattered. Alone in the silence, he whispered the truth he hadn't been able to give her. "I love you, But the room swallowed the words whole. Claire wasn't there to hear them. The cafe was quiet that evening, the kind of place chosen for privacy rather than spectacle. Andrew Carter had reserved a corner table, away from curious eyes. He rose when Claire entered, his smile warm, disarming. "You came," he said softly. Claire set her coat across the back of the chair, her nerves a tangled knot. "I said I would." They sat. The waiter brought wine, but Claire barely touched her glass. Andrew leaned forward, his voice low and earnest. "Claire, I won't pretend. I want you at Carter Capital. But this isn't only about a job. It's about giving you space to be who you are without being overshadowed by someone else's empire." His words stung, because they were true. Jonathan's shadow loomed everywhere, and she had fought daily to be seen as more than an extension of his power. Andrew continued, "I've watched you in those meetings. You're brilliant, decisive, respected. With me, you'd lead not serve, and I'd make sure the whole world knows your worth." Claire looked down at her hands. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe there was a life beyond Jonathan Steele's turbulent orbit. But before she could answer, a familiar voice cut through the quiet. Then, why does she look like her heart is somewhere else? Claire's head snapped up. Jonathan stood at the entrance, his presence filling the room even without a word. His tuxedo from the board dinner was gone. Tonight he wore a simple dark coat, his hair slightly disheveled, his eyes unguarded for once. Andrew's jaw tightened. Steele? Jonathan ignored him. His gaze was fixed on Claire, raw and unrelenting. "I can't let you walk away without hearing the truth," he said, stepping closer. "Not from him, not from anyone but me." Claire's pulse hammered. "Jonathan, this is not the place. It's the only place." He cut in. His voice wavered, but his eyes did not. "Because I've been a coward, hiding behind power, behind control. And if I wait one more second, I'll lose you forever." The cafe hushed around them, conversations fading into whispers. Jonathan stopped at the table, his breath unsteady. "Claire Whitmore, I can't imagine life without you. Not as my secretary, not as an ally, as you." The words hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. Andrew sat back, silent now, his expression unreadable. This was no longer about business. Claire's throat tightened. For weeks, she had begged silently, desperately for him to say these words. And now that they were here, they felt both healing and infuriating. She stood, her chair scraping against the floor. "Do you realize what you've done to me, Jonathan? You tested me, mocked me, pushed me past breaking just to see if I'd bend, and I didn't. But you," her voice cracked, anger spilling with the ache. "You waited until another man offered me a choice before you decided I mattered." Jonathan flinched. "I know, and I hate myself for it. But Claire, I've never known how to love. Not properly. Not without turning it into control. Until you..." Her eyes glistened. "You don't get to control this. Jonathan, not me. Not anymore." He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I don't want control. I just want you. Whatever that looks like. Whatever it takes." Silence stretched, taut as a wire. Claire's chest heaved, torn between fury and the undeniable truth blooming inside her. She had tried to deny it, bury it, even walk away from it. But her heart betrayed her every time. "Finally," she whispered, "damn you, Jonathan Steele." And then, with a shaky breath, she added, "Because against every ounce of reason, my heart already belongs to you." The words broke the tension like a dam giving way. Jonathan's eyes closed briefly, as though absorbing a pain and a blessing all at once. When he opened them, they burned with something softer than fire, something closer to devotion. Andrew rose, adjusting his jacket, his composure cool. "Then my answer is clear," he said simply. He looked at Claire with respect, not bitterness. "I wish you well, both of you." And with that, he left, the door closing behind him, Claire and Jonathan stood in the center of the cafe, the world around them buzzing faintly back to life. Jonathan reached for her hand, hesitated, then finally held it not as a command, but as a plea. "No more games," he said quietly. "No more tests. Just the truth." Claire looked at him, tears trembling at the edges of her eyes. "Then prove it. Every day. Not just in words." He nodded, solemn as a vow. "I will, for the first time." Claire allowed herself to lean into him, not fully, not yet, but enough. Enough to believe that maybe, after everything, choice and fate had finally aligned. That night, as they walked out into the rain-slicked streets together, Claire knew the road ahead would not be easy. Jonathan Steele was still a man built of storms, and she was still a woman unwilling to bow. But now, at least, they would face the storm side by side. And for Claire, that made all the difference. The Monday after everything changed, the atmosphere inside Steele Industries felt different. For years, employees had walked the halls with lowered eyes, shuffling from cubicle to cubicle like ghosts in expensive suits. Conversations were hushed, laughter rare, and the very air seemed to weigh them down. But this morning, something was new. Jonathan Steele arrived not in his usual dark, intimidating three-piece suit, but in a navy blazer, no tie, his expression less stone, more human. At his side walked Claire Whitmore, not clutching a notepad or balancing a tray of coffee, but carrying a folder embossed with her new title, Director of Strategic Human Resources. It wasn't just a promotion. It was a signal, a line drawn in bold ink. Claire wasn't the secretary who once spilled coffee on him. She was his partner in reshaping the soul of the company. Jonathan gathered the department heads in the conference room. The same mahogany table where silence and fear had once reigned now held anticipation, even skepticism. He began without preamble. "I've made mistakes," he said, his voice steady but quieter than they were used to. "For years, I believed efficiency came from control, from cutting costs, from driving people harder. But I was wrong." Murmurs rippled, employees exchanging glances. Jonathan continued, "We're restoring full health coverage to all staff, effective immediately. Dental, vision, mental health, everything we cut is coming back." There was a collective intake of breath. Even seasoned managers, who had long ago accepted the harshness of Steele's policies, looked stunned. And, Jonathan added, the food allowance, transportation support, and family leave benefits are reinstated. No one should have to choose between work and their lives outside these walls. For a moment, silence. Then Martha, the gray-haired cleaning staff who had always moved like a shadow through the halls, dabbed her eyes with the edge of her sleeve. It was the sound of decades of pent-up hope breaking open. Later that week, Claire oversaw the launch of a new initiative called Morning Circles. Every Monday, teams gathered not to recite productivity targets, but to share highlights, struggles, and ideas. Jonathan himself attended the first one, sitting shoulder to shoulder with interns, analysts, and supervisors. When his turn came, he cleared his throat, awkward but earnest. "My highlight," he said, "is realizing this company is more than balance sheets. It's people. My struggle." He paused, letting out a faint chuckle, learning how to talk like one. The room erupted in laughter, not mocking, but genuine. For the first time in memory, employees felt they could laugh with him, not at him. Claire watched from the side, her chest swelling with quiet pride. He was trying, and trying. She knew was everything. The transformation spread quickly. The break room, once a sterile place with stale coffee and vending machines that rarely worked, now smelled of fresh pastries and roasted beans. Employees lingered to talk instead of rushing back to their desks in silence. On Fridays, Jonathan himself started showing up with a box of donuts. He didn't say much, but the gesture alone left jaws slack. And then came the moment that sealed the change. "Brian, the shy intern who once wrestled with a broken stapler in silence, nervously approached Jonathan in the hallway. "Mr. Steele, I think the filing system on the third floor could be improved if we—" Jonathan interrupted, but not with the old sharpness. He placed a hand on Brian's shoulder. "Call me Jonathan and tell me more." Brian nearly fainted, but he told him, and Jonathan listened, really listened. Within a week, Brian's idea was implemented. It saved dozens of wasted hours, and Jonathan gave him credit in front of the entire staff meeting, one evening after most had left. Jonathan stood by the window of his office, looking down at the city lights. "You've changed everything," he murmured. Claire, seated across from him, glanced up from her notes. "No, Jonathan, you chose to change. I just reminded you what was at stake." He turned to her, softer than she had ever seen him. "I used to think leadership meant standing above. Now I see it means standing among." Claire smiled. "Welcome to humanity." Word spread outside the company. Investors who once praised Steele for his ruthless efficiency now marveled at the productivity gains from his renewed workforce. Articles appeared in the local business journals, not about scandals or fear, but about an unlikely renaissance inside Steele Industries. And through it all, Claire became the quiet architect designing mentorship programs, wellness initiatives, and even a laughter quota board in the break room that employees updated daily. The office that had once felt like a mausoleum now buzzed with life. Martha, the cleaner, summed it up best one afternoon as she polished the lobby floor. "Feels like spring in here. Like we can breathe again." Claire carried those words with her, knowing they were worth more than any quarterly report. Jonathan, too, carried something new: humility. He stopped demanding perfection, stopped measuring worth in profit margins alone. And though the CEO in him never vanished, the man behind the title grew visible, day by day. He no longer walked like gravity bowed to him. He walked like he belonged among his people, not above them. And when he caught Claire's eye across a crowded room, she knew this was no longer the empire of Jonathan Steele. It was a home. Autumn had settled gently over the city. Leaves, gold and amber, drifted across the sidewalks, and the crisp air carried the scent of roasted chestnuts from a vendor on the corner. Inside Steele Industries, the lights glowed warmly, no longer harsh and cold. It was a Friday evening, and the office had already emptied. But on the 27th floor, one light remained. Jonathan Steele stood in his office, not behind his imposing desk, but near the window, watching the skyline shimmer against the darkening sky. In his hand, he held a small velvet box. He had faced boardrooms, federal auditors, betrayals, and battles of pride. Yet nothing had made his palms sweat quite like this. The door opened softly. Claire Whitmore stepped inside, carrying her coat over her arm. She had stayed late, as she often did, finishing details for the wellness program she had designed. "You're still here?" she said with a gentle smile. "I thought the king of efficiency would have gone home hours ago." Jonathan turned toward her. His expression, once carved from stone, now carried warmth. "Efficiency isn't everything. Claire, some things are worth lingering for." She tilted her head, sensing something different in his tone. "You sound almost poetic tonight." He took a steadying breath, then crossed the room toward her. "I've spent most of my life believing love was a distraction, that caring was a weakness. Then you walked into my world with coffee stains and courage and proved me wrong." Her lips parted slightly, her breath caught. "Jonathan," he sank down on one knee. For a man once feared by an entire company, the gesture was humbling, vulnerable, human. Claire gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. He opened the velvet box. Inside was a ring, simple, elegant, not ostentatious. A single diamond, set in a band that glimmered softly under the office lights. "Claire Whitmore," he said, voice unsteady but true. "You change me. You reminded me that leadership isn't about control, it's about compassion. That justice and humanity matter more than numbers. And that even a man like me, who once thought himself made of stone, can learn to love." I can't imagine life without you. Will you marry me? The silence stretched, filled with the faint hum of the city below. Tears welled in Claire's eyes. She had seen Jonathan at his worst, proud, ruthless, untouchable, and she had seen him fight to become better, not for appearances, but for the people who depended on him, and for her. Yes, she whispered, then stronger. Yes, Jonathan. 1,000 times. Yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling. When he rose, she pulled him close, and their kiss was soft but certain, sealing not just love, but a promise of partnership in every sense. 2 weeks later, the company gathered in the atrium for the annual holiday celebration. Unlike years past, when the event had felt stiff and obligatory, this one brimmed with warmth. Laughter echoed off the marble walls. Employees danced, children of staff played tag between tables, and Martha, the cleaning woman, twirled with Brian, the once shy intern. Jonathan and Claire stood together at the front. He raised his glass, but instead of the usual rehearsed speech, he spoke from the heart. 6 months ago, this company ran on fear, fear of failure, fear of speaking up, fear of me. Today, it runs on something else, on trust, on compassion, on people who care about one another. That change happened because one person dared to remind me what really matters. He turned, his gaze falling on Claire, his voice softening. Sometimes, a single act, a spilled cup of coffee, a brave word, a refusal to bow can alter everything. It did for me. Applause filled the hall, loud and genuine. Claire leaned toward him, whispering with a playful glimmer in her eye. You know, one day we'll tell our kids that it all started with coffee. Jonathan chuckled, his arm around her shoulders. And they won't believe a word of it. Later that night, as the party wound down, Claire and Jonathan walked through the quiet lobby together. The floor where she had once stumbled nervously on her first day now glistened with holiday lights. Claire paused, looking around. It's hard to believe this is the same place. Jonathan nodded. It's not. You made sure of that. She squeezed his hand. No, Jonathan, we made sure of it. Together. Outside, snow had begun to fall, softening the city's sharp edges. As they stepped into the night, side by side, the world seemed less harsh, more alive. For Jonathan Steele, the man who once ruled with an iron fist, and for Claire Whitmore, the woman who dared to challenge him, the journey had been anything but easy. But in the end, they discovered a truth greater than any quarterly report or market victory, that justice, compassion, and love have the power to transform even the hardest hearts. And sometimes, it all begins with nothing more than a spilled cup of coffee. At its heart, this story isn't just about a powerful CEO or a fearless secretary. It's about the truth we often forget, that no amount of money, status, or control can replace the simple power of kindness, fairness, and love. Jonathan Steele spent years ruling with fear, believing respect could be forced and loyalty could be bought. Yet it took one brave woman, Claire Whitmore, to remind him that people are not machines. They need to be seen, valued, and cared for. The lesson is simple, but not easy. True leadership begins with compassion. When we dare to listen, when we choose fairness over profit and humanity over pride, we not only change others, we change ourselves. And perhaps there's something for each of us to carry home. It's never too late to soften a hardened heart. It's never too late to repair what fear has broken. And sometimes, the smallest act, a kind word, a shared meal, even a spilled cup of coffee can open the door to transformation. Because in the end, we all want the same thing, not just to succeed, but to belong, to matter, and to love. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and joining this journey from fear to love, from cold power to true compassion. Stories like this remind us how deeply our choices can shape the lives of others and our own. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with someone who might need a little hope today, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Your support means the world to us, and together, we can keep spreading light, one story at a time.